In 1513, a Turkish admiral named Piri Reis did something that should have been absolutely impossible. He drew a map. And not just any map. This map showed the coastline of Antarctica in perfect detail, with mountains, rivers, and bays exactly where they actually exist, under 2 miles of ice. Here is what makes this completely insane. Antarctica was not officially discovered until 1820. That is 307 years after Piri Reis drew his map. But it gets worse. Much worse. The coastline he drew is not the coastline we see today. It is the coastline that exists underneath the ice. A coastline that has been buried under glaciers for at least 6,000 years. Possibly 12,000 years. Maybe longer. The map showed up in 1929. Someone found it in the old imperial palace in Constantinople, tucked away in some dusty archive that nobody had bothered to check in centuries. When cartographers first looked at it, they thought it was interesting but wrong. The southern portion showed this weird landmass that did not match South America properly. They figured Piri Reis had just made a mistake. Bad information. Happens all the time with old maps. Then, in 1949, a joint British-Swedish expedition did seismic surveys of Antarctica. They sent sound waves through the ice to map what was underneath. And they found something that made absolutely no sense. The actual rock coastline beneath the ice matched the Piri Reis map almost perfectly. The bays were there, the mountains were there, everything lined up. But still, the academic world was not paying attention. It was just a weird coincidence. Maybe the Turkish admiral got lucky. Maybe he was guessing. Maybe the whole thing was overblown. Then in 1960, the United States Air Force got involved. And that is when everything changed. A professor from New Hampshire named Charles Hapgood had been obsessing over ancient maps for years. He taught the history of science at Keene State College, and he had this wild theory that maybe, just maybe, there had been an advanced civilization way before we thought possible, a civilization that could navigate the oceans, that could calculate longitude, that could map the entire world, and then something wiped them out, something catastrophic, something that reset everything. Hapgood took the Piri Reis map to the Air Force. Specifically, he sent it to the 8th Reconnaissance Technical Squadron at Westover Air Force Base in Massachusetts. These were not historians. These were military cartographers, the people whose literal job was to make sure maps were accurate enough to navigate bombers and missiles. They did not care about academic theories or historical timelines. They cared about one thing: is this map accurate or not? Lieutenant Colonel Harold Ohlmeyer was the commander who reviewed it. He ran the analysis personally, and on July 6, 1960, he sent Hapgood a letter that should have rewritten every history book on the planet. The letter is still available. You can read it yourself. It says, and I am quoting directly here, "The geographical detail shown in the lower part of the map agrees very remarkably with the results of the seismic profile made across the top of the ice cap by the Swedish-British Antarctic expedition of 1949. This indicates the coastline had been mapped before it was covered by the ice cap." Read that again. Mapped before it was covered by the ice cap. The United States Air Force just confirmed that someone made an accurate map of Antarctica before it was frozen. Which means someone was there, someone saw it, someone surveyed it, someone had the technology and knowledge to navigate to the bottom of the world, chart an entire continent, and then bring that information back to create a map accurate enough to match modern seismic surveys. Piri Reis himself told us where he got the information. He wrote notes directly on the map. He said he compiled it from 20 older source maps. Some of those source maps dated back to the 4th century before Christ or earlier. He specifically mentioned that he used maps from the time of Alexander the Great, which means those maps were at least 1800 years old when Piri Reis saw them, and they were copies. Copies of even older maps. How old? Nobody knows, but old enough that they showed Antarctica without ice. The Piri Reis map is not alone. In 1531, a French mathematician named Orontius Phineas created his own world map, and his version of Antarctica is even more detailed. It shows the entire continent. It shows mountain ranges in the interior. It shows rivers flowing to the coast. It even shows what looks like an ice-free passage through the center of the landmass. Modern satellites using ground-penetrating radar have confirmed that yes, there actually is a channel beneath the ice that cuts through Antarctica. Orontius Phineas drew it 500 years ago. His map shows Antarctica roughly where it actually is. The scale is surprisingly accurate. The shape is recognizable. But here is the kicker. Orontius Phineas made this map 289 years before Antarctica was officially discovered, and he showed details that we only confirmed with satellite imagery in the 21st century. Where did he get this information? He said he based it on older sources. Just like Piri Reis, always older sources. Always maps that came from somewhere else. From someone else. From some earlier time. Then there is the Buache map from 1754. Philippe Buache was the royal geographer of France. He produced a map of Antarctica that shows it as two separate landmasses, a western section and an eastern section, divided by a channel of water. For 200 years, people assumed this was just wrong. Obviously, Antarctica is one continent, except it is not. In 1958, during the International Geophysical Year, researchers finally mapped the subglacial topography completely, and they found that if you removed all the ice, Antarctica would actually be two large islands connected by a land bridge, exactly like Buache drew it in 1754, based on, you guessed it, older source maps that he said came from ancient times. Are we supposed to believe this is all coincidence? That multiple cartographers across multiple centuries all just happened to guess correctly about a continent nobody had seen? That they all independently invented details that perfectly match reality? Details that we only confirmed with modern technology? The longitude problem alone should end this debate. Calculating longitude requires either extremely accurate clocks, which were not invented until the 1700s, or sophisticated astronomical observations and mathematical tables that supposedly did not exist in the ancient world. Yet, the Piri Reis map shows longitude calculations that are accurate to within half a degree. The Air Force confirmed this. Someone, somewhere, thousands of years ago, could calculate longitude as accurately as we could in the mid-20th century. Hapgood spent decades trying to figure this out. He corresponded with Albert Einstein about it. Yes, that Einstein. And Einstein was fascinated. He wrote the foreword to Hapgood's book, Maps of the Ancient Sea Kings, in 1966. Einstein died before the book was published, but his words are right there in the introduction. He took this seriously. One of the greatest scientific minds in human history looked at these maps and said, "This deserves attention." But mainstream archaeology? Silence. The academic establishment looked at maps that showed ice-free Antarctica, that demonstrated advanced navigational knowledge thousands of years before it should have existed, that were confirmed accurate by the United States Air Force, and they just shrugged. Coincidence? Lucky guesses? Meaningless anomalies? Move along. Nothing to see here. Why? Why would verified, documented, testable evidence be ignored? What is so threatening about the idea that maybe, just maybe, human civilization is older and more sophisticated than we have been told? What falls apart if we admit that someone was mapping the world when Antarctica was green? Everything falls apart. That is what. The entire timeline collapses. If Antarctica was ice-free and inhabited recently enough for maps to survive, then we are not talking about millions of years ago. We are talking about thousands of years ago, within human memory, within the range of human civilization. And if there was a civilization advanced enough to map Antarctica 12,000 years ago, then every single thing we think we know about human history is wrong. And here is where it connects to Pompeii. Stay with me. In 79 AD, Mount Vesuvius erupted and buried the city of Pompeii in a matter of hours. An entire civilization, frozen in time. People turned to stone in the middle of their daily lives, eating meals, running from danger, holding their children. Everything preserved exactly as it was at the moment of catastrophe. Pompeii is proof that advanced societies can be erased almost instantly. And when they are erased that quickly, they leave evidence behind. Evidence frozen in place. Now imagine that happening on a planetary scale. Imagine an entire continent with cities, ports, and infrastructure suddenly flash frozen. Not gradually buried over millions of years. Flash frozen. So fast that the evidence stays preserved under the ice. That is what these maps suggest. That Antarctica was inhabited. That it was mapped. that it was known, and then something happened. Something so catastrophic that it buried an entire continent under ice in a geological instant. If you are watching this from anywhere in the world, think about this. Your city, your town, your home. Imagine waking up tomorrow and finding evidence that 12,000 years ago, this exact spot was part of a global civilization that could navigate the oceans and map the world. And then imagine that everyone in power told you that evidence does not matter, that it is just coincidence, that you should ignore it. How would that make you feel? This is not about believing every conspiracy theory. This is about looking at documented evidence and asking honest questions. The Piri Reis map exists. You can see it in the Topkapi Palace Library in Istanbul. The Air Force analysis exists. You can read Lieutenant Colonel Olmeyer's letter. The seismic data exists. Antarctica really does have an ice-free coastline beneath the glaciers. These are not disputed facts. What is disputed is what they mean. And if you want to keep exploring these questions, if you want to see where this evidence leads, you are in exactly the right place. This channel, Tales Before Tesla, exists because the biggest mysteries in history are the ones we are told not to ask about. So go ahead and hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, because what we are about to uncover goes so much deeper than a few old maps. We are talking about pyramids under the ice. We are talking about king lists that record rulers from before the flood. We are talking about a cover-up that spans generations. And it all connects. Everything connects. But those maps are just the beginning. Because if Antarctica was mapped before the ice, that means it was inhabited before the ice. And if it was inhabited, then something forced everyone to leave, or killed them all. Something sudden, something overwhelming, something that turned a temperate, livable continent into a frozen wasteland in a matter of years, maybe months, maybe days. And the evidence for what that something was? It is hiding in plain sight. It has been there the whole time. We just were not allowed to see it. The maps tell us Antarctica was once ice-free. But maps can be dismissed. They can be called errors, misinterpretations, lucky guesses. What cannot be dismissed is what lies frozen in the ice itself. Because when scientists started drilling into Antarctica, when they started pulling up core samples from miles beneath the surface, they found something that should not exist. They found proof that Antarctica froze, fast, impossibly fast. In 1968, a joint Soviet and American research team was drilling ice cores in the Antarctic interior. They were looking for climate data, trying to understand historical weather patterns. Standard scientific work. Boring, methodical, careful. They pulled up a sample from about 2 miles down. That ice was formed thousands of years ago. Layer by layer, year by year, the snow compacted into ice and preserved a record of what the atmosphere was like when it fell. And trapped in that ancient ice, they found something unexpected. Pollen. Fresh water pollen. The kind that comes from temperate climate trees and plants. Trees that cannot and do not grow in Antarctica today. Trees that require warmth, rainfall, and soil, not ice. The pollen was dated to roughly 12,000 years ago, maybe 15,000. The exact date keeps shifting as technology improves, but the range is consistent. Somewhere between 10,000 and 15,000 years. Before present, Antarctica had trees. It had flowing rivers. It had an ecosystem that could support plant life. And then it did not. The pollen layer stops abruptly. One layer has pollen. The next layer is just ice. Nothing gradual about it. No slow decline over millennia. Just a hard stop. But it gets stranger. In the McMurdo Dry Valleys, which are one of the few ice-free regions in Antarctica, geologists found fossils. Not ancient fossils from hundreds of millions of years ago. Recent fossils. Relatively speaking, fossils of beech trees, fossilized wood that still had bark on it, wood that was dated to between 2 and 3 million years ago, which sounds old until you realize that in geological terms, that is yesterday. That is a blink. And those trees were not adapted to cold. They were temperate species. The kind you would find in New Zealand today, which makes sense because Antarctica and New Zealand were once connected before the continents drifted apart. But here is the problem. The timeline does not work. If Antarctica has been frozen for 34 million years, like mainstream geology claims, then how do we have temperate forest fossils from only 2 million years ago? How do we have pollen from 12,000 years ago? Either the dating is wrong or the timeline is wrong. And the dating has been confirmed over and over again using multiple methods: radiocarbon dating, potassium-argon dating, ice core layer counting. All of it points to the same conclusion. Antarctica was not frozen solid until very, very recently. Recently enough that humans could have been there. Recently enough that humans could have mapped it. Then we have the Siberian mammoths. Now, I know what you are thinking. What do frozen mammoths in Siberia have to do with Antarctica? Everything. Because they prove that flash freezing on a continental scale is not just possible. It happened. We have the bodies. In 1846, a Russian expedition in Siberia found a woolly mammoth frozen in the permafrost. The mammoth was so well preserved that the meat was still edible. Dogs ate it. Humans ate it. 18,000-year-old mammoth meat that had been frozen so quickly, so completely, that it did not rot. And when scientists examined the stomach contents, they found something shocking. The mammoth had been eating grass and buttercups, temperate climate plants, plants that were still unchewed in its mouth, which means this animal was grazing in a relatively warm environment one moment and frozen solid the next. Not over weeks, not over days, over hours, maybe minutes. This has happened over and over again across Siberia. Dozens of mammoths found frozen with food in their mouths, food in their stomachs, still in the process of digestion, frozen so fast that ice crystals formed inside their cells before the tissue could decay. That kind of freezing requires temperatures to drop so rapidly and so severely that biological processes stop instantly. We are talking about a temperature drop of 100 degrees Fahrenheit or more in a matter of hours, across an entire continent. How does that happen? Gradual climate change does not do that. Ice ages take thousands of years to develop. Animals migrate, they adapt. They do not just drop dead in the middle of lunch. But something made these mammoths drop dead in the middle of lunch. Something fast, something catastrophic, something that shifted the climate of an entire region in less time than it takes to digest a meal. Charles Hapgood, the same man who studied the ancient maps, proposed a theory that might explain this. He called it Earth crust displacement. The idea is that the outer crust of the Earth, the lithosphere, can shift rapidly over the softer mantle beneath it, like the skin of an orange sliding over the fruit inside. If this happened, entire continents could be displaced thousands of miles in a relatively short period of time. A landmass sitting in a temperate zone could suddenly find itself at the South Pole, or vice versa. A frozen wasteland could shift into the tropics. Mainstream geologists hate this theory. They call it pseudoscience. They say there is no mechanism that could cause the entire crust to shift, except there is. It is called true polar wander, and it is a documented phenomenon. The Earth's axis of rotation can shift relative to the crust when there is a redistribution of mass. Like if a massive ice sheet forms on one part of the planet, the weight of that ice can literally pull the crust out of balance. The planet wobbles, the axis shifts, and suddenly what was north is now east. What was temperate is now polar. Albert Einstein thought Hapgood was onto something. In 1953, Einstein wrote a letter to Hapgood saying, "I find your arguments very impressive and have the impression that your hypothesis is correct." Einstein believed that a shift in the Earth's crust could explain how Antarctica ended up where it is today. He believed it could explain the flash-frozen mammoths. He believed it could explain why ancient maps showed Antarctica without ice. And Einstein was not some fringe conspiracy theorist. He was arguably the greatest scientific mind of the 20th century. But after Einstein died in 1955, the academic establishment turned on Hapgood. His theories were dismissed. His work was marginalized. He could not get funding. He could not get published in major journals. And the idea of crustal displacement was quietly buried alongside him. Too dangerous, too disruptive, too challenging to the established order. Yet, the evidence keeps piling up. In 2014, researchers drilling ice cores in West Antarctica found volcanic ash layers that suggested the ice sheet there collapsed and reformed multiple times in the last few million years. The ice is not as old or as stable as we were told. It comes and goes. It melts and refreezes. And during the warm periods, Antarctica would have been habitable, at least parts of it. Ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted in the early 2000s found something even more interesting. Beneath the ice in East Antarctica, there are subglacial lakes, huge ones. Lake Vostok, for example, is roughly the size of Lake Ontario. It sits under more than 2 miles of ice, and it is liquid. The water temperature is around -3 degrees Celsius. It stays liquid because of geothermal heat from below and the insulating pressure of the ice above. But here's the crazy part. Samples taken from Lake Vostok contain microbial life, bacteria that have been sealed off from the surface for potentially millions of years. Life existing in total darkness, under crushing pressure, in near-freezing water. Life finds a way. Even in Antarctica, if microbial life can survive under the ice, what else might be down there? What about larger ecosystems that existed before the freeze? What about remnants of human activity? Buildings, roads, cities, all perfectly preserved under 2 miles of ice, just waiting to be found. Just like Pompeii was perfectly preserved under volcanic ash. Same principle, different catastrophe. And we know the freeze happened fast because of the pollen, because of the mammoth stomach contents, because of the tree fossils that still have bark attached. Gradual freezing destroys organic material. It breaks down cell walls. It turns tissue into mush. Flash freezing preserves everything. It locks the moment in place like a photograph, like a time capsule, like someone hit pause on an entire continent and never pressed play again. So what caused it? What could shift an entire continent from temperate to polar in a geological instant? There are a few theories. The most popular one right now is the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. About 12,800 years ago, something hit the Earth, possibly a comet, possibly multiple fragments of a comet. The impacts, or more likely the airbursts, triggered massive wildfires across North America and Europe. The soot and ash from those fires blocked out the sun. Temperatures plummeted. The Younger Dryas cold period began almost overnight, dropping global temperatures by 15 degrees Fahrenheit in less than a decade. But an impact event does more than just cool things down. It can trigger crustal displacement. It can shift the magnetic poles. It can cause the Earth's axis to wobble. And if that wobble was strong enough, if the displacement was significant enough, entire continents could find themselves in new climate zones within a human lifetime. Antarctica could have been shifted from a temperate latitude to the South Pole. Siberia could have been pushed into the Arctic Circle. And millions of animals, possibly millions of people, could have been frozen in place before they even understood what was happening. This is not just speculation. The evidence is there. The pollen is there. The mammoths are there. The flash-frozen organic material is there. The geothermal lakes beneath the ice are there. And the maps showing ice-free Antarctica are there. All of it pointing to the same conclusion. Antarctica was inhabited recently, and something erased that habitability in a matter of years, maybe months, maybe days. If you are still watching this, if you have made it this far, then you are starting to see the pattern. These are not isolated mysteries. They are connected. The maps, the ice cores, the mammoths, the impact evidence. It is all part of the same story. A story about a world that existed before ours. A story about a catastrophe that reset everything. And a story that someone does not want us to figure out. So, if you are not subscribed to Tales Before Tesla yet, do it now. Hit that notification bell, because we are just getting started. The deeper we dig, the stranger this gets. And trust me, you do not want to miss what comes next. But before we move on, I want to know something. Where are you watching this from right now? What time is it where you are? Are you in North America watching this late at night when you should be sleeping? Are you in Europe during your morning commute? Are you in Asia or Australia starting your day? Drop a comment and let me know your location and your local time. Because here is what I want you to think about. Wherever you are right now, whatever time it is on your clock, 12,000 years ago, that same spot on Earth might have been in a completely different climate zone. If you are sitting in New York, you might have been under a mile of ice. If you are in Indonesia, you might have been in the middle of a vast continent that is now underwater. If you are anywhere near a coast, you were probably 300 feet inland from where the ocean is today. The world was completely different, and it changed in a single human lifetime. So, drop that comment, tell me where you are, tell me what time it is, and ask yourself, if Antarctica froze that fast, if entire continents can shift positions in a human lifetime, if advanced civilizations can be wiped out overnight, then what does that mean for us? What does it mean for the world we live in right now? Are we safe, or are we just living in the eye of a storm that is about to hit again? So, we have established that Antarctica was mapped before it froze. We have established that it froze impossibly fast. Now let us talk about what might actually be sitting under all that ice. Because in 2012, something appeared on satellite imagery that sparked a firestorm of controversy. 3 perfectly symmetrical pyramid-shaped mountains rising out of the ice in the Ellsworth mountain range. And they do not look natural. The images came from Google Earth. Anyone with an internet connection could see them. And almost immediately, researchers started measuring the dimensions and angles. What they found was disturbing. These structures have nearly identical slope angles to the pyramids at Giza, the same mathematical precision, the same orientation, the same proportions, and they are massive. We are talking about structures that would dwarf the Great Pyramid if they are actually constructed rather than geological formations. Now, the mainstream explanation is simple. They are just mountains, perfectly pyramid-shaped mountains, with 4 distinct sides, meeting at precise apex points, oriented along cardinal directions. All perfectly natural. Nothing to see here, which would be a reasonable explanation except for one small problem. Mountains do not form like that. Wind erosion creates irregular shapes. Tectonic uplift creates ridges and peaks, not geometric pyramids. Volcanic activity creates cones, not 4-sided structures with flat faces. Nature does not do right angles and perfect symmetry. Humans do. But we cannot just fly down there and check, because of what happened in 1946, Operation Highjump. This is where the story gets genuinely weird. And when I say weird, I mean documented, verified, government-acknowledged weird. Not conspiracy theory weird, historical fact weird. In August of 1946, the United States Navy launched the largest expedition to Antarctica in history. They called it Operation Highjump. The official mission was to establish a research base, test equipment in cold weather conditions, and train personnel for future operations in polar environments. Standard military stuff, except the scale was insane. Admiral Richard Byrd commanded the operation. They sent 4,700 men, 13 ships, 33 aircraft. This was not a research expedition. This was an invasion force. For context, when the United States actually invaded Normandy on D-Day, they used around 150,000 troops. Operation Highjump sent nearly 5,000 men to Antarctica to study penguins and ice. Does that make sense to you? Because it did not make sense to a lot of people at the time either. The operation was supposed to last 6 to 8 months. It lasted 6 weeks. They pulled out early, abruptly, with no official explanation beyond vague references to weather conditions and equipment failures. But here is what makes it interesting. Admiral Byrd gave an interview to a Chilean newspaper, El Mercurio, on March 5, 1947, right after returning from Antarctica. He was quoted as saying that the United States needed to prepare defenses against enemy air fighters which come from the polar regions, and that in the case of a new war, America could be attacked by fighters that are able to fly from one pole to the other with incredible speed. Enemy fighters. From the polar regions. Flying at incredible speeds. What enemy? Who was stationed in Antarctica in 1947? The Nazis were defeated. The Japanese were defeated. The war was over. So who exactly was Byrd talking about? The interview was published. It exists in the archives of El Mercurio. You can look it up. But American newspapers barely mentioned it. The military never commented on it. And Byrd himself never elaborated publicly. He gave classified testimony to Congress. That testimony remains classified to this day, 77 years later, still classified. What did he tell them that was so sensitive it cannot be released even now? Then in 1959, 12 years after Operation Highjump, something unprecedented happened. 12 nations signed the Antarctic Treaty. Eventually, 54 nations ratified it. This treaty declared Antarctica a scientific preserve. No military activity allowed, no weapons testing, no territorial claims, and most importantly, no independent civilian exploration without government approval. You cannot just charter a boat and go exploring Antarctica. You need permits. You need official authorization. You need government oversight for every single step. Why? Why would 54 nations, including rival superpowers during the Cold War, agree to lock down an entire continent? What is so important about Antarctica that the United States and the Soviet Union, who could not agree on anything, both agreed that civilians needed to be kept away from it? The official reason is environmental protection and scientific cooperation, which sounds noble. Except the treaty was signed in 1959, long before anyone cared about environmental protection. The Environmental Protection Agency was not founded until 1970. Greenpeace did not exist until 1971. But somehow in 1959, the entire world suddenly decided that Antarctica needed to be protected from human activity, unless they were protecting something else. Unless they found something during Operation Highjump that made every major government in the world agree that Antarctica needed to be controlled, locked down, monitored. And the strange activity did not stop there. In 1958, just before the Antarctic Treaty was signed, the United States conducted nuclear weapons tests in the upper atmosphere, Operation Argus. They detonated 3 nuclear warheads in space above the South Atlantic near Antarctica. The official reason was to study the effects of nuclear explosions on the Earth's magnetic field and radio communications. But one of the test sites was directly over the ocean approaches to Antarctica. Why there? Why not over the Pacific? Why not over unpopulated areas of the Arctic? Why specifically near the routes to Antarctica? Then there are the no-fly zones. If you look at flight tracking data, commercial aircraft almost never fly over Antarctica. The official reason is that it is too remote, too dangerous. Emergency landing sites are unavailable, which makes sense for the interior of the continent. But flight paths also avoid the coastal areas and even nearby ocean routes that would save fuel and time on certain routes between Australia, South America, and Africa. Airlines avoid these routes even when they would be more efficient. Why? What are they avoiding? People have tried to explore Antarctica independently. In 2013, a group of private researchers attempted to reach one of the pyramid sites in the Ellsworth Mountains. They had funding, they had equipment, they had experienced polar guides. Their permit application was denied. No explanation given, just denied. They reapplied with revised plans. Denied again. They are not the only ones. Numerous private expeditions have been blocked over the years, always with vague bureaucratic reasons, always without transparency. And then there is the Google Earth problem. If you spend time looking at satellite imagery of Antarctica, you will notice something odd. Large sections of the continent are blurred or pixelated, not because of cloud cover, not because of poor image quality, deliberately obscured. You can see high-resolution images of nearly every square inch of Earth. You can zoom in on your own house and count the shingles on your roof. But large portions of Antarctica are just blank spots or low-resolution smears. Why would satellite imagery of an uninhabited frozen wasteland need to be censored? Unless it is not uninhabited. Unless there is something there that someone does not want people to see. And before you dismiss this as paranoid conspiracy thinking, remember that we have already established facts. Antarctica was mapped before it froze. Check. Antarctica froze impossibly fast. Check. There are pyramid-shaped structures visible on satellite imagery. Check. The United States sent a massive military force there in 1946 and pulled out abruptly. Check. Admiral Byrd talked about enemy aircraft from the polar regions. Check. 54 nations immediately locked down the entire continent. Check. These are not theories. These are documented historical events. So what is the alternative explanation? That all of this is coincidence? That the pyramids are just weird mountains? That Operation Highjump was just a training exercise that happened to require 5,000 men? That the Antarctic Treaty was just about protecting penguins? That Google Earth blurs random sections of Antarctica for no reason? At what point does coincidence become pattern? Now, I am not saying I know what is under the ice in Antarctica. I am not claiming there are ancient cities or secret bases or alien technology. What I am saying is that the evidence suggests something is there. Something significant enough that governments have spent 77 years making sure ordinary people cannot go look for themselves. And that should bother you. Because if there is nothing to hide, why hide it? Let us talk about the geometry of those pyramids for a second, because this is where it gets really interesting. The Great Pyramid of Giza has a base length of 756 feet and a height of 481 feet. That gives it a slope angle of roughly 51.8 degrees. One of the Antarctic pyramids, the one that has been most thoroughly analyzed from satellite data, has an estimated slope angle of 52 degrees. Nearly identical, the odds of a natural formation randomly matching the precise angle of the most famous pyramid on Earth? Astronomical. But it is not just the angle. The Giza pyramids are aligned to true north with an accuracy of 3/60ths of a degree. That is incredibly precise. You need sophisticated astronomical observations and mathematical calculations to achieve that level of accuracy. The Antarctic pyramids? Also aligned to cardinal directions. Also precise. Also seemingly deliberate. And here is the thing that really should make you pause. The Giza pyramids are aligned to the constellation Orion. Specifically, the three main pyramids match the three stars in Orion's belt. This alignment was perfect around 10,500 before Christ, which is way before the ancient Egyptians supposedly built them. But let us say, just for argument, that alignment is coincidence. Fine. Except researchers have analyzed the Antarctic pyramids and found that they also appear to be aligned with astronomical features. Specifically, they align with the position of certain stars as they would have appeared around 12,000 years ago. The same time period as the Younger Dryas, the same time period as the flash freeze, the same time period as the ice-free Antarctica shown on the Piri Reis map. Are we really supposed to believe that is all random chance? That natural mountains just happen to form in pyramid shapes with slope angles matching Giza, aligned to cardinal directions, positioned to match star patterns from 12,000 years ago? How many coincidences does it take before we admit there might be a pattern? Look, Tales Before Tesla is not about telling you what to believe. We are about showing you what they do not want you to see, about asking questions that make people uncomfortable, about connecting dots that the mainstream wants to keep separate. So, if this resonates with you, if you are tired of being told not to ask questions, then subscribe. Hit that notification bell. Because we are about to connect these pyramids to something even bigger. We are about to talk about ancient king lists that record rulers from before the flood. Rulers who supposedly reigned for thousands of years. Rulers who might have built these pyramids. And rulers whose existence threatens to unravel everything we think we know about human history. The Antarctic pyramids are not just interesting geological anomalies. They are potential proof that advanced human civilization existed long before we were told it was possible. And if that is true, then someone has been lying to us for a very long time. The question is not whether the pyramids are real. The question is, what else are they hiding under the ice? And why? Every ancient civilization on Earth has a list, a record of their kings, who ruled, for how long, and what they accomplished. These lists are usually pretty straightforward. King so-and-so ruled for 30 years. His son ruled for 20. Standard historical record keeping. Except when you go back far enough, something strange happens. The numbers stop making sense. Kings start ruling for thousands of years, tens of thousands, and every single ancient culture, from completely different parts of the world, has these same impossible records, all describing the same thing. Rulers from before the flood. The Sumerian king list is the most famous example. It was written on clay tablets around 2000 before Christ in ancient Mesopotamia. The list chronicles every king who ruled Sumer, going back to the very beginning, and the beginning is wild. The tablet says, after the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. Then it lists the first king, Alulim, who ruled for 28,800 years. Not a typo. 28,800 years. One guy. The next king, Alongar, ruled for 36,000 years. Then Enmenluana ruled for 43,200 years. This goes on for 8 kings, all ruling for impossibly long periods, all before something called the flood swept over. Then after the flood, the kingship descended again, and the reign lengths become more normal. A few hundred years, then a few decades, then down to realistic human lifespans. But those pre-flood kings? They are just sitting there in the official historical record, ruling for millennia. Mainstream archaeology treats this as mythology. Obviously, nobody lived for 40,000 years. Obviously, these are symbolic numbers. Obviously, this is just ancient people making up stories about gods. Except the Sumerians did not treat these records as mythology. They treated them as history. They kept meticulous records of everything: tax receipts, legal contracts, administrative documents. They were obsessed with accuracy. And right there in the middle of all their careful historical record keeping, they included kings who ruled for 30,000 years. Why would a culture known for precision suddenly decide to make up absurd numbers for no reason? Unless the numbers are not absurd. Unless they are recording something real, something we do not understand yet. Now let us jump to Egypt. Completely different part of the world. Different language, different culture, different writing system. And they have the exact same thing. The Turin King Papyrus lists all the pharaohs of Egypt going back to the beginning. And before the human pharaohs, it records dynasties of gods and demigods who ruled Egypt for tens of thousands of years. The papyrus is damaged, so we cannot read all of it, but what survives is clear. There were rulers before the flood, before recorded history, before what we call civilization, and they ruled for impossibly long periods. Manetho, an Egyptian priest who lived around 300 before Christ, wrote a complete history of Egypt. His original work is lost, but fragments survive in the writings of later historians. Manetho claimed that before the first human dynasty, Egypt was ruled by gods for 13,900 years. Then demigods ruled for another 11,000 years. Then came the spirits of the dead who ruled for another 5,813 years. Add it all up, and you get more than 30,000 years of pre-flood rulers before the first human pharaoh even took the throne. The Palermo stone, one of the oldest historical records in Egypt, also references followers of Horus who ruled before the dynastic period. No specific numbers survive on the stone, but the implication is clear. Egypt had rulers before the pharaohs. Rulers from a time we no longer remember. Let us go to India. The Vedic texts, some of the oldest religious writings on earth, describe vast cycles of time called yugas. The Satya Yuga, the first age, lasted 1,728,000 years. The Treta Yuga lasted 1,296,000 years. These are not symbolic numbers. They are specific, detailed, recorded in multiple texts across centuries. And during these yugas, according to the Vedas, advanced civilizations rose and fell. Beings with incredible knowledge and technology ruled the earth. Then catastrophes destroyed them. Over and over again. The Mahabharata, one of the great epics of India, describes wars fought with weapons that sound suspiciously like modern technology. Flying vehicles called vimanas. Weapons that produced explosions resembling nuclear blasts. Cities destroyed in single strikes that left the ground scorched and radioactive. And all of this supposedly happened hundreds of thousands of years ago. Long before humans were supposed to have advanced civilization. Long before we were supposed to have writing or cities or technology. Yet there it is, written down in texts that predate Christianity by centuries. Now go to China. The Chinese have records of emperors ruling before what they call the Great Flood, the Bamboo Annals, compiled around 296 before Christ, list rulers going back more than 2 million years. 2 million. And again, these are not treated as myths. They are historical records, official chronicles maintained by the imperial court. Go to Mesoamerica. The Aztec and Mayan calendars record cycles of creation and destruction. They talk about previous worlds that were destroyed by catastrophes. They give specific dates. The Mayan long count calendar begins in 3114 before Christ, but the mythology describes multiple creation cycles before that. And the Aztecs believed we are currently living in the fifth sun, the fifth world. The previous four were all destroyed, wiped out, reset. Go to Greece. Plato wrote about Atlantis. He gave specific dates. He said Atlantis was destroyed 9,000 years before Solon visited Egypt. Solon lived around 600 before Christ. Do the math. That puts the destruction of Atlantis around 11,600 years ago, right in the middle of the Younger Dryas, right when Antarctica froze, right when the mammoths died with food in their mouths, right when sea levels rose 20 meters in a geological instant, right when something catastrophic reset the entire planet. Every culture, every continent, every ancient civilization has the same story. There were rulers before the flood, advanced beings, long-lived kings, sophisticated societies, and then something destroyed them all. The flood swept over, the world ended, and humanity had to start again from scratch. Now, here is where it connects to Antarctica. What if these king lists are not mythology? What if they are memories? Corrupted, exaggerated, distorted by thousands of years of oral tradition, but ultimately based on something real. What if there actually was a global civilization before the flood? A civilization advanced enough to navigate the oceans, map the continents, build pyramids, and record their history in king lists that survived the catastrophe. Where would that civilization have been centered? It would need to be somewhere coastal, somewhere with access to the oceans for navigation, somewhere temperate enough to support large populations, somewhere that could serve as a hub for global trade and communication. And it would need to be somewhere that was completely destroyed by the Younger Dryas catastrophe. Somewhere that was erased so thoroughly that we lost all memory of it except in myths and legends. Antarctica fits perfectly. Before the freeze, it was temperate. It had rivers and forests. It was positioned near the center of the ancient supercontinent configuration, making it an ideal location for a maritime civilization. The Piri Reis map shows detailed coastlines, suggesting extensive exploration and mapping. The pyramids suggest permanent structures and settlements, and the king lists from around the world all describe rulers who existed before the flood that destroyed everything. What if the Sumerian kings who ruled for 30,000 years were not individuals but dynasties? Not one person living forever, but a continuous line of rulers from a civilization that lasted tens of thousands of years. A civilization that kept meticulous records. A civilization that built in stone so their monuments would survive. A civilization that tried to warn future generations about the catastrophe that was coming. Because here is the thing about those king lists. They do not just record rulers. They record the flood. Every single one mentions it. The Sumerian king list says the flood swept over. The Egyptian records talk about the destruction before the dynasties. The Vedic texts describe catastrophes that ended each yuga. The Chinese annals mention the Great Flood. The Mayan calendar records the destruction of previous worlds. It is always there, always the same event, always the reset. And after the flood, everything changes. The rain lengths drop to normal human lifespans. The technology disappears. The global navigation stops. Humanity becomes tribal again, fragmented, starting over, building back slowly from the ruins of what came before. The Bronze Age does not begin until around 3000 before Christ. Writing does not emerge until around the same time. Civilization, as we understand it, begins again. But the king lists remember what came before. They remember the time before the flood. They remember the rulers who built the old world, the world that Antarctica was part of. What if those pre-flood rulers were centered in Antarctica? What if that was the capital of the ancient global civilization? What if the pyramids we see poking through the ice are just the tops of much larger structures buried beneath? What if there are entire cities down there, flash frozen and perfectly preserved, just waiting to be found? Cities that would prove the king lists were not mythology. Cities that would prove Plato was recording real history. Cities that would prove human civilization is far, far older than we have been told. That is what the Antarctic Treaty is really protecting. Not penguins, not ice. The truth. The truth that everything we think we know about human origins is wrong. The truth that advanced civilization existed before the flood. The truth that something destroyed it. And the truth that it could happen again. Because if the Earth's crust can shift once, it can shift again. If a comet impact can trigger a global catastrophe once, it can happen again. If Antarctica can freeze in a matter of years, other continents can too. The king lists are not myths. They are warnings. Warnings from the survivors of the last reset. Warnings that we have ignored for 12,000 years. And the evidence is sitting under the ice in Antarctica, perfectly preserved, exactly like Pompeii was preserved under volcanic ash. All we have to do is go look. But they will not let us. Because once we see what is down there, once we confirm that the king lists were real, the entire structure of accepted history collapses. And powerful institutions do not like their foundations collapsing. August 24th, 79, Anno Domini. Pompeii was having an ordinary day. People were buying bread. Children were playing in the streets. Merchants were haggling over prices. Someone was painting graffiti on a wall. Someone else was baking fish in their kitchen. Life was normal. Life was routine. And then Vesuvius exploded. Within hours, the city was gone, buried under 20 feet of volcanic ash and pumice. But here is the thing about how Pompeii was destroyed. It did not burn. It did not crumble. It was encased, frozen in time. When archaeologists excavated the city 1700 years later, they found everything exactly as it had been at the moment of catastrophe. The bread was still in the oven, the fish was still on the plate, the graffiti was still wet on the wall, and the people were still there, turned to ash and stone, but still there, still holding their children, still running from the pyroclastic flow, still frozen in the last seconds of their lives. Pompeii proves something crucial. It proves that advanced civilizations can be erased completely and instantly, not gradually, not over centuries of decline, instantly. One day, you have a thriving city with running water, entertainment venues, sophisticated architecture, international trade networks. The next day, you have nothing, just ghosts trapped in volcanic stone. Now, think about Antarctica, not as a continent, as a city, as a civilization, as Pompeii on a planetary scale. The geological evidence tells us Antarctica did not gradually cool over millions of years. It flash froze. The pollen record shows temperate climate one layer, frozen wasteland the next. The mammoths in Siberia died with unchewed food in their mouths. The ancient maps show detailed coastlines that should not exist, and the king lists from around the world all record the same event. The flood, the catastrophe, the reset. Everything points to one conclusion. Something happened 12,000 years ago that was so sudden, so violent, so overwhelming, that it buried an entire continent under ice in less time than it takes for organic matter to decay, just like Pompeii. Except instead of 20 feet of volcanic ash, Antarctica got buried under 2 miles of ice. And instead of preserving one city, it preserved everything. The entire continent, every structure, every artifact, every piece of evidence that an advanced pre-flood civilization existed, all of it sitting there, perfectly frozen, perfectly preserved, waiting to be found. This is not speculation. This is pattern recognition. We know catastrophic preservation works because we have Pompeii. We know flash freezing works because we have the Siberian mammoths. We know rapid climate change works because we have the ice core data. We know Antarctica was different 12,000 years ago because we have the maps and the pollen. All we are doing is putting the pieces together. And when you put them together, the picture is obvious. But let us talk about what happened 12,800 years ago. Let us talk about the Younger Dryas impact event, because this is where Pompeii and Antarctica become the same story. Around 10,800 before Christ, something hit the Earth, most likely a comet that broke into multiple fragments. The impacts, or more accurately the airbursts, occurred primarily over the North American ice sheet. The evidence is everywhere once you know what to look for. There is a layer of sediment at exactly that date that contains nanodiamonds, tiny diamonds that only form under extreme pressure and temperature. Like what happens when a cosmic object explodes in the atmosphere, the same layer contains iridium. Iridium is rare on Earth, but common in asteroids and comets. When you find an iridium spike in the geological record, it means something from space hit us. The most famous iridium spike is at the Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary 66 million years ago. That is the impact that killed the dinosaurs. But there is another spike at 12,800 before present. Smaller, but it is there. And it is global. You find it in sediment cores from North America, Europe, Asia, and yes, near Antarctica. The same layer contains spherules, tiny glass beads that form when rock is vaporized by extreme heat and then cools rapidly in the atmosphere. You see spherules at nuclear test sites, you see them at impact craters, and you see them in sediment from 12,800 years ago, all over the world. Then there is the burn layer. Archaeologists call it the black mat. It is a layer of charcoal and soot that appears at the same date across multiple continents. It represents massive wildfires, continental scale burning. The kind of burning you get when a cosmic airburst ignites entire forests simultaneously. The kind of burning that blocks out the sun and triggers an instant ice age. And that is exactly what happened. The Younger Dryas cold snap began within years, possibly months, of this impact. Global temperatures dropped 15 degrees Fahrenheit. The ice sheets that had been melting suddenly stopped melting. In some places, they started growing again. Sea levels, which had been rising, suddenly rose even faster as parts of the ice sheet collapsed from the impact shock waves, dumping trillions of gallons of meltwater into the oceans. Coastlines were inundated. Lowland areas flooded. And then everything froze. This is the flood, not a biblical myth, not a metaphor. A real, documented, scientifically verified catastrophe that drowned coastlines and froze continents. The flood that appears in every ancient culture's mythology. The Sumerian flood, the Hindu flood, the Chinese flood, the Greek flood, the Mayan flood. They are all describing the same event. Because it was global, it affected everyone, and it destroyed the world that came before. Now let us connect this to Antarctica specifically. Before the Younger Dryas, Antarctica was positioned differently. Charles Hapgood proposed that the Earth's crust can shift over the mantle when weight distribution changes dramatically. An impact event would absolutely cause this. The shock wave would destabilize the crust. The sudden melting of ice sheets would redistribute mass, and the planet would wobble, the axis would shift, and continents would slide into new positions. If Antarctica was located several thousand miles north of where it is now, it would have been temperate. It would have been habitable. It would have been the perfect location for a maritime civilization to thrive. And then, in the space of a few years, it would have slid south into the polar region and frozen, not gradually, not over millennia, fast enough that the trees did not have time to rot, fast enough that the pollen stayed preserved in layers, fast enough that if there were people there, if there were cities there, they would have been frozen exactly like the mammoths, exactly like Pompeii. The pyramids we see on satellite imagery would have been the tallest structures, the peaks that rose above the ice even as everything else was buried. And beneath those pyramids, beneath 2 miles of ice, there could be entire cities, ports, roads, temples, libraries, all preserved, all waiting, all proving that the king lists were not myths. But here is what really connects Pompeii and Antarctica. In both cases, we have warnings that were ignored. At Pompeii, Vesuvius had been showing signs of activity for days. There were earthquakes, there were strange smells, the wells were drying up, but people did not leave. They did not believe a catastrophe was coming. They thought the mountain was stable, they thought they were safe, and then they died. At Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, there is a stone pillar, Pillar 43. It was carved around 9,500 before Christ, about 1,500 years after the Younger Dryas impact. The pillar shows a series of symbols. For decades, archaeologists assumed they were just decorative. But in 2017, researchers at the University of Edinburgh analyzed the symbols using astronomical software, and they realized the carvings matched the positions of constellations on the date of the Younger Dryas impact. Specifically, they show a comet or asteroid in the sky. The pillar is not decoration, it is a warning. It is saying, this happened. Remember this. Do not forget. The people who carved that pillar were survivors. They lived through the catastrophe. They saw the sky fall. They watched the world end. And they tried to warn us. They built Göbekli Tepe, the oldest known megalithic structure on Earth, not as a temple or a monument, but as a time capsule, as a message to future generations saying, this can happen. This will happen again. Be ready. The same message is encoded in the pyramids. The same message is recorded in the king lists. The same message is hidden in myths and legends across every culture. Catastrophes are not rare. They are cyclical. They happen over and over throughout history. And advanced civilizations get reset every time. The Bronze Age collapsed around 1200 before Christ. The fall of the Roman Empire, the extinction of the megafauna, the Toba supervolcano 70,000 years ago that reduced the human population to perhaps 10,000 individuals. We are not the first advanced civilization. We are just the latest. Pompeii is a microcosm of this pattern, a reminder that no matter how advanced we think we are, no matter how safe we think we are, catastrophe can strike without warning. The people of Pompeii went to bed thinking about their taxes and their love affairs and their dinner plans. They woke up to the end of the world. And 12,000 years ago, the people of Antarctica, if there were people there, experienced the same thing. They woke up to fire in the sky, floods destroying the coasts, and temperatures dropping so fast that entire continents froze within their lifetimes. And here is what should terrify you. The Younger Dryas impact was not the worst event in the geological record. It was not even close. The Toba eruption was worse. The Chicxulub impact that killed the dinosaurs was incomprehensibly worse. And those are just the events we know about. There are impact craters all over Earth that we have barely studied. There are extinction events in the fossil record that we do not understand. And there are probably catastrophes that were so thorough, so complete, that they left almost no evidence behind. Except for myths, except for king lists, except for maps showing coastlines that should not exist. If you are watching this from your home, wherever that is, understand that you are living on a planet that has been repeatedly reset by catastrophes. You are living in the recovery period after the last reset, and we have no idea when the next one is coming. The magnetic poles are shifting faster now than at any point in recorded history. The sun is entering a period of increased activity. Asteroid near misses are becoming more frequent. We are not safe just because we have technology. The people of Pompeii had technology too. They had running water and concrete and advanced engineering, and it did not save them. Antarctica is not just an ice-covered continent. It is a crime scene. It is evidence of what happens when catastrophe strikes. It is Pompeii at planetary scale. And if we were allowed to excavate it, if we were allowed to drill through the ice and see what is underneath, we would find the proof. We would find the cities. We would find the answers. But we are not allowed, because the answers would change everything. And institutions do not like change. They like control. They like the comfort of accepted narratives, even if those narratives are wrong. If you are still here, if you have watched this far, then you are someone who asks questions. Someone who does not just accept what you are told. And that is exactly who needs to subscribe to Tales Before Tesla. Because we are not done, we are not even close. We are about to talk about why the evidence is being suppressed. Who benefits from keeping Antarctica locked down? And what happens when the ice finally melts and the truth comes out? Hit that subscribe button. Turn on notifications. Because what comes next is going to make you question everything you thought you knew about history, about power, and about who decides what truth is. Let us talk about what happens when you challenge the timeline. Not with conspiracy theories, not with wild speculation, with evidence, with data, with scientific methodology that meets every academic standard. Let us talk about what happens when credentialed researchers, people with doctoral degrees from prestigious institutions, people who have spent decades in their fields, publish findings that contradict the accepted narrative. They get destroyed. Robert Schoch is a geologist. He has a PhD from Yale University. He is a professor at Boston University. In 1990, he was invited to Egypt to examine the Sphinx, not by fringe researchers, by legitimate Egyptologists who wanted a geological assessment of erosion patterns on the monument. Schoch looked at the Sphinx and immediately recognized something that should not be there. Water erosion. Deep, vertical weathering patterns that only form from prolonged rainfall. Heavy rainfall. The kind of rainfall that Egypt has not experienced in recorded history. The Sahara Desert has been arid for about 5,000 years. The Sphinx, according to mainstream archaeology, was built around 2500 before Christ, which means it should show wind erosion, sand erosion, not water erosion. But the erosion patterns are undeniable. They go deep into the bedrock. They required centuries of rainfall to form. which means the Sphinx is much, much older than 2500 before Christ. Schoch calculated, based on the erosion, that the core body of the Sphinx was carved sometime between 7000 and 9000 before Christ, possibly earlier. He published his findings, peer-reviewed, geologically sound, and the Egyptology establishment lost their minds. Not because his geology was wrong. Nobody challenged his geological analysis. They challenged his conclusion. They said he must be mistaken because the accepted timeline does not allow for sophisticated stone carving in Egypt before 3000 before Christ. Therefore, the erosion must be from something else. Maybe underground water, maybe morning dew, maybe anything except rain, because if it is rain, then the timeline is wrong, and if the timeline is wrong, then everything built on that timeline collapses. Schoch was ridiculed. His work was dismissed as pseudoscience despite being based on standard geological principles. Conference invitations dried up. Funding became difficult. His reputation within academia was damaged, not because he did bad science, because he challenged the narrative, and the narrative must be protected at all costs. John Anthony West, the researcher who originally brought Schoch to Egypt, faced even worse treatment. West had no formal academic credentials, which made him an easy target. He was labeled a fringe theorist, a charlatan, someone not worth taking seriously. Never mind that his observations about the Sphinx erosion were correct. Never mind that he brought credentialed experts to verify his claims. Never mind that his work was featured in mainstream documentaries and reached millions of people. The academic establishment refused to engage with the evidence because engaging with it would mean admitting they might be wrong. Graham Hancock wrote a book called Fingerprints of the Gods in 1995. The book presented evidence for an advanced global civilization that existed before the last ice age and was destroyed by the Younger Dryas catastrophe. He cited the Piri Reis map. He cited the Sphinx erosion. He cited megalithic structures around the world that show astronomical alignments to dates far older than their supposed construction. He did not make wild claims. He asked questions. He presented anomalies. He suggested that maybe, just maybe, human civilization is older than we think. The book became an international bestseller. Millions of copies sold. It sparked public interest in alternative archaeology. And the academic response was not to debate the evidence. It was to attack Hancock personally. He was called a pseudoscientist, even though he never claimed to be a scientist. He clearly presented his work as investigative journalism, not peer-reviewed research. But that did not matter. He was dangerous because he was popular. He was reaching people outside the academic gatekeepers. He was making people question the accepted timeline, and that could not be tolerated. Fast forward to 2015. Hancock appeared on the Joe Rogan podcast. The episode was watched by millions of people. He presented the same evidence he had been presenting for decades: the ancient maps, the erosion patterns, the astronomical alignments, the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. And this time, the backlash was not just from archaeology departments. Major media outlets published hit pieces calling him a charlatan and a danger to scientific literacy, not because he presented false information, because he presented information that contradicted the mainstream narrative to an audience of millions without academic filter. Here is the pattern. When evidence emerges that challenges the timeline, the response is never to investigate further. It is to attack the messenger, discredit the researcher, protect the narrative. Why? Because the entire structure of academic archaeology and ancient history is built on a specific timeline. Textbooks are written based on that timeline. Careers are built defending that timeline. Funding is allocated to research that supports that timeline. If the timeline is wrong, then decades of work becomes obsolete. Thousands of papers become irrelevant. Entire departments lose credibility. And nobody wants to be the person who admits they spent 40 years teaching something that was fundamentally incorrect. So instead, they suppress, they gatekeep, they control the narrative through funding and publication. If you want a grant to study ancient civilizations, you better propose research that fits the accepted framework. If you want to publish in a major journal, your conclusions better not threaten established chronologies. If you want tenure, you better not rock the boat. The system is designed to perpetuate itself, not to find truth. To maintain consensus, let us talk about the Smithsonian Institution. Between 1860 and 1930, newspapers across the United States regularly reported discoveries of giant skeletons, 7 feet tall, 8 feet tall. Some reports claimed 10 or 12 feet, hundreds of articles, different locations, different excavators, different time periods, all describing the same thing. Skeletons of unusually large humans found in burial mounds, often with sophisticated grave goods and artifacts suggesting advanced culture. Where are these skeletons now? Gone. The Smithsonian supposedly collected many of them. Official records show acquisitions. But when researchers request to examine these specimens, they are told the skeletons were lost, misplaced, or accidentally destroyed. Over and over again. Every giant skeleton that might prove humans were significantly larger in the past has disappeared. Convenient. In 1993, the Supreme Court of the United States heard arguments in a case involving Native American remains. During the proceedings, a Smithsonian whistleblower came forward, claiming the institution had deliberately destroyed thousands of skeletal remains that did not fit the accepted narrative of human development. Giant skeletons, elongated skulls, anatomical anomalies that suggested something other than standard Homo sapiens development. The whistleblower was discredited, the claims were dismissed, and nothing came of it. But the accusation is out there. On the record, the Smithsonian, the most trusted museum institution in America, was accused of destroying evidence to maintain a narrative. Now let us talk about Antarctica specifically. Why is it so difficult to get there? The official answer is safety and environmental protection. Fine, reasonable. Except private expeditions to Mount Everest are allowed. Everest is far more dangerous than most of coastal Antarctica. People die on Everest regularly, but you can go if you have money and determination. Antarctica? No. You need government approval. You need permits from multiple agencies. You need approved guides. You need to submit detailed plans. And even then, certain areas are completely off limits. No explanation. Just forbidden. In 2004, a team of researchers wanted to use ground-penetrating radar to survey the area around the pyramid-like structures in the Ellsworth Mountains. Legitimate scientists. University-funded. Peer-reviewed proposal. Denied. The official reason was environmental concerns. What environmental concerns? They were not going to drill. They were not going to excavate. They were going to point radar at the ground from a distance. How does that harm the environment? It does not. But it might reveal something, and whatever it might reveal is more important to hide than to discover. There is a section of Antarctica called Wilkes Land. In 2006, a NASA gravity survey detected a massive impact crater beneath the ice. We are talking about a crater 300 miles wide, one of the largest impact structures on Earth. The impact that created it would have been catastrophic. Global firestorms, mega tsunamis, possible mass extinction event. The crater is dated to approximately 250 million years ago, which corresponds to the Permian-Triassic extinction, the worst mass extinction in Earth's history. 96% of all marine species died. 70% of land species died. The planet almost became completely sterile. This discovery was published in legitimate scientific journals. It was huge news in the geology community. And then nothing. No follow-up expeditions. No detailed surveys. No attempts to drill core samples. Just silence. Why? A crater that size would have ejecta scattered across multiple continents. It would have left evidence everywhere. Studying it could revolutionize our understanding of mass extinctions and impact events. But nobody is studying it, because to study it properly, you would need unrestricted access to Antarctica, and unrestricted access is not allowed. Let us talk about academic funding. If you are a young researcher and you want to study ancient civilizations, where does your money come from? Grants. Usually from government agencies like the National Science Foundation or from private foundations controlled by universities. To get those grants, you submit proposals. Those proposals are reviewed by committees. Those committees are made up of established academics who built their careers on the existing timeline. Academics who have no incentive to fund research that might prove them wrong. So, if you propose research that fits the narrative, you get funded. If you propose research that challenges the narrative, you get rejected. Not officially because of the challenge. Officially, it is because the methodology is questionable, or the hypothesis is not well supported, or the expected results are not significant enough. But the real reason is control. The gatekeepers control who gets money, and money controls what research happens. It is a closed loop that reinforces itself. There have been researchers who tried to break out of this system, who self-funded, who went independent, who published outside traditional journals. And you know what happened? They got labeled fringe, pseudoscientists, not credible. Because if you are not publishing in approved journals, if you are not affiliated with approved institutions, then your work does not count. No matter how solid the evidence, no matter how rigorous the methodology, if you are outside the system, you do not exist. This is not paranoia. This is how academic institutions work. They are conservative by design. They are supposed to be skeptical. But there is a difference between healthy skepticism and reflexive denial. Healthy skepticism says, "Show me the evidence, and I will evaluate it fairly." Reflexive denial says, "That contradicts what I already believe, therefore it must be wrong." And here is the real question. If the evidence for pre-flood civilizations is so weak, if the alternative theories are so easily disproven, then why the aggression? Why the hostility? Why the career destruction? If Graham Hancock is just a crackpot with no credibility, why do major media outlets feel the need to publish hit pieces every time he releases a new documentary? If Robert Schoch's erosion analysis is obviously wrong, why not just ignore it? Why the coordinated effort to discredit and suppress? Because the evidence is not weak. The evidence is strong enough to be threatening, strong enough that if it reaches a wide audience, if people start asking questions, if independent researchers start getting funding, the entire narrative could unravel. And institutions do not like unraveling. They like stability. They like control. They like being the ones who decide what is true and what is not. So they suppress, they gatekeep, they attack, and they hope that most people will not notice, that most people will just accept the mainstream timeline without question, that most people will dismiss alternative theories as conspiracy nonsense without actually examining the evidence. And for a long time, that worked, but not anymore. Because now we have the internet. Now information spreads without gatekeepers. Now millions of people can watch a video like this and see the evidence for themselves. And that terrifies the establishment. Because once people start thinking for themselves, once people start questioning authority, the control is gone. And the truth, whatever that truth is, becomes inevitable. Tales before Tesla exists because the questions matter more than the comfort of accepted answers. Subscribe if you want to keep asking those questions. Because we are about to show you how modern technology is finally breaking through the suppression. How ground-penetrating radar, satellite imagery, and independent research is revealing what has been hidden. And how the evidence in Antarctica is becoming impossible to ignore, no matter how hard they try to bury it. Technology is doing something that academic gatekeepers never anticipated. It is making suppression impossible. You can control who gets funding. You can control who publishes in journals. You can control who gets permits to dig. But you cannot control satellites. You cannot control radar. You cannot control independent researchers with their own equipment and their own funding who do not need institutional approval. And right now, in 2024, those technologies are revealing things beneath the Antarctic ice that match exactly what the ancient maps, the king lists, and the catastrophe evidence have been telling us all along. In 2021, a team from the British Antarctic Survey published findings from ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted over several years. They were looking at ice sheet stability, trying to understand how quickly Antarctica might melt due to climate change. Standard climate research. Nothing controversial. But the radar does not just show ice. It shows what is underneath the ice. And underneath the ice, in several locations, they found geometric anomalies, straight lines, right angles, patterns that do not occur in natural geology. The published paper does not speculate about what these anomalies are. It just notes them as irregularities in the subglacial topography and moves on. But the data is there. and independent researchers started analyzing that data immediately. One of these anomalies is located in Queen Maud Land, about 200 miles inland from the coast. The radar signature shows a rectangular structure approximately 800 meters long and 300 meters wide. It has defined corners. It has uniform depth. It sits on bedrock in an area where natural formations should be irregular and chaotic from glacial movement. The structure is buried under 1.7 miles of ice, which means it has been there since before the ice formed, since before the Younger Dryas, since the time when Antarctica was temperate and mapped and, if the evidence is correct, inhabited. The British Antarctic Survey did not send a follow-up expedition to investigate this anomaly. They did not drill core samples. They did not do detailed surveys. They just noted it and moved on. Why? Because investigating it would require explaining what it is. And if it is what it appears to be, a constructed structure beneath the ice, then every textbook needs to be rewritten. So instead, ignore it. Publish the data because you have to, then hope nobody notices. Except people noticed. Independent researchers noticed. And they started looking at other radar surveys, other satellite data, other geological studies that might have similar anomalies buried in the appendices and footnotes. And they found them, dozens of them, scattered across Antarctica, all with similar characteristics. Geometric precision, defined edges, locations on stable bedrock, all buried under ice that formed 12,000 years ago. Then there is LIDAR, light detection and ranging. It uses laser pulses to create incredibly detailed three-dimensional maps of terrain. For decades, archaeologists assumed that dense jungle and forest areas were archaeologically empty because you could not see through the canopy. The Amazon rainforest was considered pristine wilderness, untouched by human civilization. Then they started using LIDAR, and they found cities, massive cities, road networks, agricultural terraces, irrigation systems, structures that house tens of thousands of people, all hidden under the jungle canopy, all completely invisible to traditional surveys. In 2022, LIDAR surveys of the Amazon revealed over 24 previously unknown settlements. Some of these sites cover more than 100 square miles. They have organized street grids. They have defensive earthworks. They have evidence of sophisticated water management. These were not small villages. These were urban centers, and they existed for thousands of years before European contact. We had no idea they were there because the jungle hid them, just like the ice in Antarctica is hiding what is underneath. The same technology is starting to be applied in other empty regions. The Sahara Desert, Central Asia, Northern Australia. Everywhere LIDAR goes, it finds evidence of human activity that was invisible before. Structures, settlements, agriculture, civilization in places we were told were always empty, which raises an obvious question. If we were this wrong about the Amazon, if we missed entire cities because we could not see through trees, what else are we missing? What is hidden under deserts that used to be fertile? What is hidden under ice that used to be temperate? Antarctica is the ultimate LIDAR target. 2 miles of ice is opaque to traditional observation, but ground-penetrating radar and seismic tomography can see through it. And the technology is getting better every year. Resolution is improving. Processing power is increasing. Independent universities and even private companies are launching their own surveys, and the data is becoming public, not because institutions want it public, because the technology makes suppression impossible. You cannot hide satellite imagery anymore. You cannot classify radar data that 20 different teams are collecting simultaneously. The information is getting out whether the gatekeepers like it or not. In 2023, a team from the University of Texas used seismic tomography to map subsurface structures in Wilkes Land, the location of that massive impact crater. They were studying the crater itself, trying to understand the impact dynamics. But their seismic waves revealed something unexpected about 50 miles from the crater center: a void space, a large hollow area beneath the ice where there should be solid rock or compressed ice. The void is roughly circular, about 300 meters in diameter, with what appears to be a domed ceiling. Natural caves do not form like that in Antarctica. The geology is wrong. The ice pressure would collapse any natural cavity, but this void is stable. It has been there for thousands of years, which means something is supporting it. something strong enough to hold back 2 miles of ice. The published paper mentions the void as an anomalous cavity requiring further investigation, and then, predictably, no further investigation was conducted. Because investigating would mean drilling, and drilling would mean finding out what is creating that void. And if the answer is a constructed dome, a built structure designed to survive being buried under ice, then the implications are staggering. But here is where it gets interesting. That team from the University of Texas made their raw seismic data publicly available. Standard academic practice for reproducibility. And when independent researchers analyzed that data, they found something the original team either missed or chose not to mention. The seismic reflections from the void show internal structures, divisions, chambers, patterns consistent with architectural spaces, not natural cavities. The data is right there. Anyone can download it and analyze it themselves, and the conclusion is unavoidable. There is something built under the ice in Wilkesland. No mainstream institution will touch this, because touching it means admitting the possibility, and admitting the possibility means everything changes. But the data exists, the evidence exists, and it is not going away. Meanwhile, genetic research is revealing things that support the alternative timeline. In 2018, a study of ancient human DNA found something unexpected. There are genetic markers in modern human populations that do not fit the standard out of Africa migration model. Specifically, there are markers that suggest human populations existed in coastal regions that are now underwater, regions that were above sea level 12,000 years ago before the meltwater pulse. The genetic diversity suggests these populations were large, sophisticated, and widespread. And then they disappeared. The genetic record shows a bottleneck around 12,000 years ago, a sudden reduction in population diversity consistent with a catastrophic event. Where were these coastal populations? We do not know because their settlements are now under 300 feet of ocean, but we know they existed, and we know they were technologically advanced enough to thrive in diverse environments across the globe. The genetics prove it, which means there was a global maritime culture before the flood, exactly like the myths describe, exactly like the maps suggest, exactly like the King List record. Underwater archaeology is finding the physical evidence. Off the coast of India, in the Gulf of Combat, sonar surveys have revealed what appears to be a submerged city. Structures with right angles, stone blocks in organized patterns, artifacts that have been carbon dated to 9,500 years ago. The Indian government sent divers down. They recovered pottery, tools, and building materials. But when they tried to publish their findings, they faced the same resistance. Mainstream archaeologists claimed the structures were natural. The artifacts were dismissed as contaminated or misdated, and funding for further investigation was denied. The same thing happened at Yonaguni in Japan, a massive stepped structure underwater, clearly showing tool marks, clearly artificial, dated to the end of the last ice age, dismissed as natural despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. The same thing happened at Dwarka, also off the coast of India. The same thing happened at structures found off the coast of Cuba. Over and over, underwater archaeology finds evidence of pre-flood civilization, and over, that evidence is dismissed, defunded, and suppressed. But the technology is making suppression harder. Sonar is cheap now. Diving equipment is accessible. Independent researchers do not need institutional approval to explore international waters. And every year, more evidence surfaces. More structures are found, more artifacts are recovered. The pieces are coming together whether the establishment cooperates or not. And in Antarctica, the ice is melting. Not everywhere, not uniformly, but it is melting. Coastal areas that were solid ice 20 years ago now have exposed rock during summer months. Glaciers are retreating, ice shelves are collapsing, and as the ice retreats, things are being revealed. In 2019, researchers found exposed bedrock in the Transantarctic Mountains that showed clear evidence of human-style stoneworking, blocks with flat faces, edges that looked cut rather than fractured. The discovery was photographed, sampled, and then quietly buried in a database where it would not attract attention. But people are paying attention now. Independent researchers, citizen scientists, people with access to satellite imagery and the skills to analyze it. People who do not need grants or institutional approval. People who are looking at Antarctica not as an empty frozen wasteland, but as a time capsule waiting to be opened. The current investigation is not happening in universities. It is happening online, in forums and communities where researchers share data freely, where evidence is analyzed collaboratively, where suppression is impossible because there is no central authority to suppress. This is the new paradigm: decentralized research, open source investigation, and it is working. The pyramids are there. The subsurface structures are there. The geometric anomalies are there. The genetic evidence is there. The underwater cities are there. The ancient maps were right. The king lists were right. The myths were memories. And modern technology is finally proving it. The only question left is how long the establishment can keep pretending none of this exists. Because the evidence is not going away. It is accumulating. And eventually, the weight of it becomes undeniable. Eventually, even institutions have to acknowledge reality. And when that happens, when Antarctica finally reveals what is under the ice, everything we thought we knew about human history ends, and something much older, much stranger, and much more incredible begins. We started with a map that should not exist, a map drawn in 1513 showing Antarctica without ice, showing coastlines that have been buried for 12,000 years, showing details that we only confirmed with satellites in the 21st century. That map was not a mistake. It was not a lucky guess. It was a copy of something older, something that came from a time before the flood, from a civilization that could navigate the world and record what they found. Then we followed the evidence. The ice cores showing Antarctica was temperate until it flash froze, the mammoths dying mid-meal, the pollen layers stopping abruptly, the geological proof that continents can shift position rapidly when catastrophe strikes. Not over millions of years, over years, maybe months, fast enough to bury an entire civilization before anyone could escape. We found the pyramids, 3 massive structures rising through the ice in the Ellsworth Mountains, geometric precision matching Giza, aligned to cardinal directions, positioned to correlate with stellar alignments from 12,000 years ago. Structures that should not exist if human civilization only goes back 6,000 years. Structures that make perfect sense if Antarctica was the center of a pre-flood maritime culture. We examined the king lists, Sumerian rulers reigning for 30,000 years, Egyptian dynasties of gods lasting 13,000 years, Hindu yugas spanning hundreds of thousands of years, Chinese emperors recorded back 2 million years. Every ancient culture on Earth describing the same thing: rulers before the flood, advanced beings, sophisticated civilizations, and then the catastrophe, the reset, the flood that swept over everything. We connected it to Pompeii, to the principle of catastrophic preservation, to the understanding that civilizations can be erased instantly and perfectly frozen in time. Pompeii under volcanic ash, Antarctica under 2 miles of ice. Same principle, different scale. And if Pompeii could preserve bread in ovens and graffiti on walls, then Antarctica could preserve entire cities, entire libraries of knowledge, entire records of who we were before the world ended. We documented the suppression, the career destruction of researchers who challenged the timeline, the denial of funding for investigations that might prove the mainstream narrative wrong, the Antarctic Treaty locking down an entire continent, the mysterious circumstances of Operation Highjump, the censored satellite imagery, the ignored radar anomalies, the pattern of evidence being dismissed, defunded, and buried whenever it threatens established chronology. And we showed how technology is breaking through that suppression. Ground-penetrating radar revealing geometric structures under the ice, LiDAR finding lost cities in the Amazon, seismic tomography detecting voids and chambers where natural geology should be solid, genetic studies proving maritime populations existed on now submerged coastlines, underwater archaeology recovering artifacts from before the flood, independent researchers analyzing public data and finding what institutional gatekeepers refuse to acknowledge. All of this points to one conclusion: human civilization is older than we have been told, much older. We did not begin 6,000 years ago in Mesopotamia. We began tens of thousands of years ago, possibly hundreds of thousands. We built cities. We navigated oceans. We mapped continents. We recorded our history in stone and in stories passed down through generations. And then something destroyed us. The Younger Dryas impact. The crustal displacement. The flood. The flash freeze. Whatever you want to call it, 12,800 years ago, the world ended, and we had to start over. But we did not start from zero. The survivors remembered. They carried knowledge with them. They built megalithic structures encoded with astronomical alignments to preserve that knowledge for future generations. They carved warnings on stone pillars. They recorded king lists describing the world before the catastrophe. They drew maps showing coastlines that would eventually be buried under ice. They tried to tell us, we just were not listening. Until now. Because now the ice is melting. Now technology can see through jungle canopies and ocean depths and glacial sheets. Now independent researchers can analyze data without needing institutional permission. Now information spreads globally in seconds, not decades. The suppression is failing. The truth is emerging. And what that truth reveals is both humbling and terrifying. Humbling because we are not the first. We are not the pinnacle of human achievement. We are not the most advanced civilization that has ever existed. We are the latest in a cycle. We are the inheritors of knowledge we barely understand from people we barely remember. Everything we think we invented, someone invented before. Everything we think we discovered, someone discovered before. We are not pioneers. We are relearners, rediscoverers, standing on foundations we did not build, reading maps we did not draw, inheriting a legacy we were never told about. And terrifying because if it happened before, it can happen again. The Earth's crust can shift, comets can impact, climate can change catastrophically in a matter of years. The magnetic poles, which are currently moving faster than at any time in recorded history, can flip. The sun, which operates on cycles we barely understand, can unleash energy bursts that sterilize continents. We are not safe. We have never been safe. We are just living in the calm period between storms, and the next storm could come tomorrow. Or it could come in 10,000 years. We do not know. But the geological record is clear. Catastrophes are not anomalies. They are the norm, and advanced civilizations get erased every time. This is why the warnings were carved in stone. This is why Göbekli Tepe shows a comet on the date of the Younger Dryas impact. This is why the pyramids align to stars from 12,000 years ago. This is why the king lists record impossibly long reigns before the flood. These are not myths. These are not religious texts. These are scientific records, time capsules, messages from the survivors of the last catastrophe telling us, this happened, remember this, prepare for when it happens again. But we forgot. We ignored the warnings. We dismissed the evidence as primitive mythology. We convinced ourselves that catastrophes only happen in the distant past, that we are somehow exempt from the cycles that govern planetary history. We are not. We are subject to the same forces that buried Antarctica, the same forces that froze the mammoths, the same forces that destroyed Pompeii in a single afternoon. And those forces are still active, still operating, still waiting. So, what do? We remember. We investigate. We demand transparency. We pressure governments to allow unrestricted research in Antarctica. We support independent researchers who are doing the work that institutions refuse to do. We share information. We ask questions. We refuse to accept comfortable lies when uncomfortable truths are staring us in the face. And we prepare. Not with bunkers and stockpiles, though those might help. We prepare by preserving knowledge, by recording what we have learned in ways that might survive catastrophe, by building structures that encode information in mathematics and astronomy, by creating redundancy, by ensuring that if civilization collapses again, the survivors have access to the knowledge they need to rebuild faster, to not lose everything the way we lost everything 12,000 years ago. The ice in Antarctica is melting. Within our lifetimes, areas that have been frozen since the Younger Dryas will be exposed. And when that happens, when we can finally see what is underneath, the truth will be undeniable. The cities will be there. The structures will be there. The artifacts will be there. The proof that everything we were taught about human history is incomplete at best and deliberately false at worst. And on that day, the academic establishment will have to answer for why they suppressed this evidence for so long, why they destroyed careers, why they denied funding, why they locked down an entire continent to prevent people from seeing what was there. But we do not have to wait for that day. The evidence is already here. The maps exist. The erosion patterns exist. The king lists exist. The genetic data exists. The radar anomalies exist. The underwater cities exist. The pyramids rising through the Antarctic ice exist. All of it pointing to the same conclusion. We are not the first advanced civilization. We are not even the second or third. We are part of a cycle that has repeated over and over throughout the history of this planet. And the only way to break that cycle is to remember, to learn from what came before, to take the warnings seriously. This is not ancient history. This is not some academic debate about pottery shards and carbon dating. This is about understanding who we are, where we came from, and what we are capable of surviving. This is about recognizing that the lost legacy beneath the Antarctic ice is not just their story. It is our story. We are the descendants of the survivors. We carry their DNA. We inherited their knowledge, even if we forgot most of it. And we have a responsibility to remember, to investigate, to preserve, to prepare. So, here is what I am asking you to do. Do not just watch this video and move on. Share it. Talk about it. Demand transparency from governments and institutions. Support researchers who are asking these questions. Visit the sites yourself if you can. Look at the evidence with your own eyes. And most importantly, do not let them convince you that asking questions makes you a conspiracy theorist. Asking questions makes you a rational human being who refuses to accept incomplete answers. Subscribe to Tales Before Tesla, not just because we are covering interesting topics, because we are part of a community that refuses to forget. A community that honors the legacy of the people who came before us by remembering their warnings. A community that demands truth, even when truth is uncomfortable. Hit that bell notification. Share this video with everyone you know, because the more people who understand what is really under the ice in Antarctica, the harder it becomes to suppress. The harder it becomes to ignore. The harder it becomes to pretend that human history is simple and settled and complete. The King List is not ancient history. It is a warning. Antarctica is not just ice. It is our past. And maybe, if we are not careful, our future. The truth has been frozen long enough. It is time to let it thaw. It is time to see what we have lost. And it is time to make sure we never lose it again. Because the next catastrophe is coming. The geological record guarantees it. The only question is whether we will be ready, whether we will remember, whether we will learn from the civilization that came before us and tried so desperately to make sure we would not make the same mistakes. The ice is melting. The truth is emerging. And history, real history, is about to be rewritten. Make sure you are part of that conversation. Make sure you are asking the right questions. Make sure you remember. Because they tried to warn us. And this time, we need to listen.